This is the new mutator from Ratchet and Clank for PlayStation Portable. And that is our buddy Dan making out with his girlfriend. Alright.
Hey, cow kisser!
You're dead. You guys are dead.
Your girlfriend's hot, man. Your girlfriend's hot.
The Mutator. All new weapons, all new levels. Ratchet and Clank size matters. Rated everyone 10 and up. PSP.
Usually, when we talk about game releases, the focus tends to be on how certain games performed in specific regions, like how The Last of Us did in America and Europe, or how successful The Legend of Zelda was in Japan. And of course, there's always curiosity about how Japanese games, like Final Fantasy, fared in Western markets. But what if we flipped the script? What if we asked, how successful was a Western game in Japan? That's exactly what we're diving into today, and to kick things off, we're going to look at Ratchet and Clank, a series that's beloved in the West, but how did it fare in Japan? Let's find out. Ratchet and Clank first landed in Japan on December 3, 2002 to a wave of excitement and positive reception. To push the game even further, Sony went all out. They released a special edition PS2 model, a sleek, soft blue console bundled with the game itself, and the strategy paid off. Within a year, Ratchet and Clank performed so well that it earned an updated PlayStation the Best re-release, but Japan's love for the game didn't stop there. Sony doubled down with yet another budget re-release under the Best Price label, and even published a dedicated Japanese strategy guide. Marketing-wise, Ratchet was everywhere, TV commercials, print ads, you name it. And just like Crash Bandicoot, Sony gave Ratchet a bit of a makeover for the Japanese audience. He sported exaggerated eyebrows, a more animated personality, and was voiced by an actor who brought an energetic flair, perfect for a space-faring hero. All of these efforts paid off, with Ratchet & Clank selling 500,000 units in Japan, an impressive feat for a Western-made game in a market traditionally dominated by homegrown titles. After the success of Ratchet & Clank, Sony wasted no time bringing its sequel to Japan. On December 11, 2003, Ratchet & Clank 2 made its way overseas, but this time, it received some extra special treatment. First, the box art was completely different from its Western counterparts, and even the name changed depending on the region. Sony also pulled out all the stops with the marketing. The Japanese commercials for Ratchet & Clank 2, pure art.
いやいや、ラブレターもらったっすね。
なんでよ、見るなよ。
やるっす。ゆうたさんすごいっす。
やだな、こんなのいらないよ。本当に困るな。まじゃ
よーし、任せな。やったっす。ラチェットやったっす。
銀河のトラブル解決はラチェット&クランク2。
Just like the first game, a dedicated strategy guide was released, and this one went all out, bright, colorful, and packed with detail. Sales-wise, Ratchet & Clank 2 performed well enough to earn another PlayStation the Best re-release. But here's where things get interesting. Sony actually re-released the game twice under its Best Price budget label, once on July 8, 2004 and again on November 2, 2005. Overall, while Ratchet & Clank 2 sold slightly less than the original in Japan, it was still a commercial and critical success, proving that the Lombax and his robotic sidekick had a real fanbase in the East.
やべ、おならしたくなっちゃった。あ、俺も。
2の破壊力が子供騙しに見えるぜ。ラチェット&クランク3。
プレイステーション。
Ratchet & Clank's momentum showed no signs of slowing down. The third installment, Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal, or as it's known in Japan, Ratchet & Clank 3, Totsukiki Galactic Rangers, was yet another commercial success. Not only did the game perform well in Japan, Europe and America, but it also found success in South Korea. In fact, Up Your Arsenal outpaced its predecessor in sales and, like the previous entries, eventually earned another PlayStation the Best re-release. That's 3 consecutive hits in a row for a Western-made game in Japan, something you don't hear about too often. Ratchet & Clank wasn't just surviving in the East, it was thriving. With Up Your Arsenal proving to be yet another commercial success for both Sony and Insomniac, the studio wasted no time in releasing the more mature-centric Ratchet and Clank Deadlocked, or as it was titled in Japan, Ratchet and Clank 4 Girigiri Jinga no Jiga Battle. Unlike previous entries, Deadlocked featured a noticeably dark tone, and Japan's version embraced this shift with a unique, cartoonish box art depicting a battle-ready Ratchet wielding guns with a more serious expression. To add to the distinctiveness, a special Japanese opening sequence was created exclusively for this version, an interesting touch considering the game's mature themes and darker humor. Sales-wise, Deadlocked performed well, even managing to slightly outsell Going Commando. Not long after, Size Matters arrived in Japan under the title Ratchet and Clank 5 Ikitotsu Dodeka Jinga no Mirimiri Gandan, and surprisingly it also performed well in the region that made 2 back-to-back hits in a short span. Then came Circuit Agent Clank, a spin-off installment that, while receiving a PlayStation the Best re-release, struggled to reach the same heights as its predecessors. It became the least well-received entry in the franchise at the time, selling more than 51,000 copies. Despite this, Ratchet & Clank had an undeniably lucrative run on the PS2 in Japan. The fact that 6 games in the series earned PlayStation the Best re-release speaks volumes about its popularity. However, as Sony transitioned into the PS3 era, the tides began to shift, and not in Ratchet & Clank's favor. With the arrival of the PS3, Sony unleashed a wave of stellar first-party titles: Genji, Days of the Blade, Uncharted, Resistance, and of course, Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, known in Japan as Ratchet & Clank Future. However, something was noticeably different this time around. Unlike its PS2 predecessors, Tools of Destruction didn't receive a distinct Japanese box art or a particularly eye-catching regional title. On top of that, Sony's marketing push in Japan wasn't nearly as strong as it had been during the franchise's golden years on the PS2. Despite these hurdles, Ratchet & Clank Future still managed to find success, selling 48,000 copies in Japan. But in a surprising turn of events, this was actually less than what Secret Agent Clank had sold, a clear indication that the series' momentum in Japan was starting to slow. To boost sales, Sony issued 2 best price re-releases, but even these struggled to match the success of the original Ratchet & Clank saga on the PS2. It was becoming clear that Ratchet & Clank's golden era in Japan was fading. On August 21, 2008, Sony released Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty in Japan under the title Ratchet & Clank Future Gaiden Kaisoko Dark Water no Hiho. However, there's a bit of a tragedy here. Quest for Booty never received a physical release in Japan, making its sales numbers something of a mystery. A year later, on November 19, 2009, Ratchet & Clank Future: A Crack in Time launched in Japan as simply Ratchet & Clank Future 2. This time, Sony tried to reinvigorate the franchise presence with a region-specific box art, but honestly, it was minimal to say the least. They did roll out a few print ads and even a single TV commercial to push the game, but despite these attempts, Future 2 would mark a disappointing milestone. It became the first mainline Ratchet & Clank title in Japan not to receive a PlayStation the Best re-release. The game only managed to sell 36,000 copies, which was even lower than Tools of Destruction by a few thousand. Fast forward to October 20, 2011, and we see the release of Ratchet & Clank All for One. This time, the title remained largely the same across all regions, but Japan got a unique box art. Ratchet striking a pose, Captain Quark behind him, Dr. Nefarious on the right, and his robotic sidekick on the left. Seeing the decline, Sony tried to rekindle interest by releasing a collection of the original PS2 trilogy in 2012 under the title Ratchet & Clank 1, 2, 3 Jinga Saikyu Gorgeous Pack. 2 years later, they followed up with another exclusive Japanese bundle, Ratchet & Clank Jinga Saikyu 3-Star Pack, which contained all 3 digital-only Ratchet games from the PS3 era. Looking at the numbers, it's clear Ratchet & Clank's popularity in Japan had begun to fade with each release. The golden age was over. Even though Ratchet & Clank is no longer a multi-thousand seller in Japan, Sony doesn't seem to mind. Despite sales dwindling over the years, the franchise has managed to build a dedicated cult following in the country, and it is likely one of the reasons Sony continues to localize and release new entries there. Take Ratchet and Clank on the PS4, for example. The game sold a total of 35,000 units in 2016, which isn't exactly groundbreaking. Yet Sony still went the extra mile, releasing a special limited edition exclusively for the Japanese market. And 5 years later they followed up with Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, known in Japan as Ratchet and Clank Parallel Trouble. The game had a strong debut, ranking as the third best-selling retail title during its first week with 14,000 copies sold, but ultimately it only managed to sell 24,000 copies in total, making it the second lowest performing entry in the franchise, just above All for One. So what does this all mean? After diving into the numbers, the answer is pretty clear. Ratchet & Clank was once a powerhouse in Japan, particularly during the PS2 and mid-PS3 era, but today not so much. While it still has a loyal fanbase and people still talk about it in Japanese forums, it's nowhere near the juggernaut it used to be, and certainly not big enough for Sony to throw all their weight behind it in the region. That said, the fact that Sony still releases these games in Japan despite declining sales, that's proof enough that Ratchet & Clank still means something, at least to those who've stuck with it.